I stood next to my best friend on the happiest day of his life with a single folded piece of paper in my jacket pocket, and I knew that in the next 10 minutes, that piece of paper was going to end everything he thought he was walking into. I had known him since we were 7 years old. I had never once lied to him, and yet, standing there in a rented tuxedo with a microphone about to be handed to me, I understood I was either about to save a woman I barely knew or destroy the one friendship that had defined my entire life. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Ryan Matthews, and the man getting married that day was Tyler Brooks, my best friend since the 2nd grade. We grew up 2 streets apart in a small town outside Sacramento, the kind of place where everybody's parents knew everybody else's parents, and where Tyler and I had built a friendship that survived 2 decades of moves, breakups, job losses, and everything else life throws at people who grow up together. Tyler was the kind of person people naturally gravitated toward, confident, funny, the guy who always had a plan even when the plan changed halfway through. I was the quieter one, the one who noticed details Tyler usually missed. That difference between us had never mattered before. It was about to matter more than either of us could have imagined. What I didn't fully piece together until much later was that the 6-year gap on that marriage certificate lined up almost exactly with the one real rift Tyler and I ever had in our entire friendship. Around that time, I had taken a job 2 states away, in Denver, chasing a promotion I thought I couldn't turn down, and Tyler and I had a falling out shortly before I left. A stupid, prideful argument over something that feels almost embarrassing to bring up now, about a loan I had asked him to help me with, and a comment he made that I took the wrong way at the time. We barely spoke for close to 2 years during that stretch, the longest gap in communication we ever had since the 2nd grade, and it was during exactly that window, while I was 3 states away and not speaking to him, that Tyler met Hannah, married her, and, as I would later learn, quietly let that marriage fall apart without either one of us ever properly closing it out. By the time Tyler and I patched things up and I moved back closer to home, that entire chapter of his life had already ended in his mind, and he simply never brought it up again, and I never thought to ask, because I had no reason to believe there was anything left to ask about. Tyler met Claire Bennett almost 2 years before the wedding, at a mutual friend's barbecue, and from the very first conversation he had with her, I watched my best friend become a different, calmer version of himself. Claire worked as a pediatric nurse, the kind of person who remembered your name after meeting you once, and asked genuine follow-up questions when you answered her. She had a warmth to her that made people feel like the most interesting person in the room, and Tyler, who had spent most of his 20s chasing one short relationship after another, seemed to finally settle into something steady with her. I liked Claire immediately. More than that, I trusted her, which is not something I say about many people. When Tyler asked me to be his best man, I didn't hesitate for a second. The trouble started about 6 weeks before the wedding, in a way that felt completely unremarkable at the time. Tyler asked me to help him move some old boxes out of a storage unit he'd been renting since college, boxes he said he hadn't opened in years. We were sorting through old textbooks and photographs when I found a manila envelope wedged at the bottom of a box, unlabeled, slightly yellowed at the edges. Tyler had stepped outside to take a phone call, so I opened it without thinking much of it, expecting old report cards or maybe tax documents. Instead, I found a marriage certificate from a courthouse in Nevada, dated 6 years earlier, with Tyler's name on it, and a woman's name I had never once heard him mention in over 20 years of friendship. I sat there on the concrete floor of that storage unit for what felt like a very long time, reading that document over and over, waiting for it to make sense in some ordinary way it never did. There was no divorce paperwork in that envelope, nothing to indicate the marriage had ever been legally ended. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that people sometimes forget to mention a short, impulsive marriage from their early 20s, that maybe it had been annulled somewhere I hadn't found the paperwork for. When Tyler came back inside, I put the envelope back exactly where I found it and said nothing, telling myself I would ask him about it later, privately, when the timing felt right. That right moment never seemed to come, and the wedding kept getting closer. What still strikes me, even now, is how completely Tyler managed to erase that marriage from every conversation we ever had for over 20 years of friendship. People slip, people mention old exes by accident, bring up strange chapters of their past over a few beers without meaning to. Tyler never once did, not in college, not during the years we lived 4 blocks apart, not during any of the long nights where friends usually let their guard down and admit to things they'd rather forget. Looking back, I don't think that was an accident or a simple oversight. I think it took real, sustained effort to keep something like that buried for 2 decades, and understanding that told me more about how deeply ashamed Tyler was of that chapter than any single conversation we ever had after the wedding. I spent the next several weeks doing something I never imagined I would do to my closest friend. County divorce records aren't always public in every state, and after 2 days of dead ends searching on my own, I ended up paying a records search service online, the kind normally used by process servers and private investigators, just to confirm whether any divorce filing existed anywhere connected to that certificate. What I found did not put my mind at ease. It did the opposite. There was no divorce filing anywhere in that state, or in any neighboring state I could locate. I found an address for the woman named on that certificate, a woman named Hannah Reyes, still living less than 4 hours from where Tyler and Claire were planning to spend their honeymoon. I never called her. I never confronted Tyler directly either, because some part of me kept hoping I had misunderstood something, kept hoping there was a version of this where my best friend hadn't been about to marry Claire while still legally married to someone else. 3 days before the wedding, I finally worked up the nerve to bring it up with Tyler alone, over beers on his back porch, the same porch where we'd had 100 ordinary conversations over the years. I asked him carefully, without accusation in my voice, whether there was anything from his past he thought Claire might not fully know about. Tyler laughed it off at first, told me every guy has a few skeletons, and changed the subject to the seating chart. I pushed a little further, and for just a moment, something shifted in his expression, something brief and unguarded, that told me he understood exactly what I was circling around without saying it directly. Then it passed, and he smiled again, and told me not to worry so much, that everything was under control. I went home that night and printed a copy of that marriage certificate, folded it, and put it in the inside pocket of the jacket I would be wearing 3 days later. Looking back now, I think part of why I hesitated for so long had nothing to do with Tyler at all, and everything to do with the kind of friendship we had built our lives around. We had been each other's constant for 25 years, through his parents' divorce when we were 14, through the year I lost my job and slept on his couch for 3 months, through more late nights and hard conversations than I could ever count. Loyalty in my mind had always meant standing beside someone no matter what, and some part of me kept telling myself that finding a way to protect Tyler from this, to give him more time, to let him be the one to fix it in his own way, was simply what loyalty required of me. It took me a long time to understand that loyalty to a person and loyalty to the truth are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for someone is refuse to help them keep lying, even when it costs you the friendship in the process. I also thought, more than once during those 6 weeks, about what my own life would look like if I said nothing and simply let the wedding happen. Tyler and Claire would go on their honeymoon, come home, build a life together, and there was a real possibility, however small, that Hannah Reyes would never resurface, that the paperwork would remain buried, and that nobody would ever have to know what I had found in that storage unit. I sat with that possibility more seriously than I am proud to admit, turning it over on long drives home from work, wondering if silence might genuinely be the kinder option for everyone involved. What finally convinced me otherwise was picturing Claire's face on some future afternoon, years down the line, discovering the truth on her own, and realizing that people who claimed to care about her, myself included, had known and said nothing while she built an entire life on a foundation none of us believed was solid. The morning of the wedding, I told myself several times that I would find a private moment before the ceremony to speak with Tyler one final time, to give him a real chance to fix this himself before anyone else got hurt. That moment never arrived. Between photographs, groomsmen duties, and Tyler's own nervous energy filling every quiet gap, I never once had him alone. By the time the ceremony started, Claire was walking down the aisle in a dress her mother had helped her choose, radiant and completely unaware, and I was standing at the altar beside my best friend with a folded piece of paper in my jacket pocket that I now understood only I could decide what to do with. The reception moved into toasts a little after 7 that evening, string lights above the tables, laughter carrying across the lawn, everyone believing they already knew exactly how this story ended. When the wedding planner tapped my shoulder and told me I was up next, I felt the folded paper against my chest, like it weighed considerably more than a single sheet should. Claire's father had just finished his toast, something warm about watching his daughter find a partner who deserved her, and the whole tent was still laughing softly when I stood up from my seat, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the small platform where the microphone was waiting for me. I started the way every best man is expected to start, thanking everyone for coming, making a small joke about how long I had known the groom, watching Tyler grin at me from his seat beside Claire with an ease that told me he had no idea what was coming. I talked for a minute or two about our childhood, about the kind of friend Tyler had always been to me, and every word of it was true, which somehow made the next part harder rather than easier. I could feel the paper against my chest the entire time I spoke, and I remember thinking that I still had a choice, that I could sit back down right now and let this day belong to two people who believed they were starting something honest together. I did not sit back down. Instead, I told the room that before I finished, there was something I needed to say directly to Claire, something I had wrestled with for weeks and had finally decided she deserved to know before, and not after, she made this marriage legally permanent. The laughter in the tent died almost instantly, replaced by the particular kind of silence that happens when 200 people realize at the same moment that the tone of the evening has changed. Claire's smile faltered first, her eyes moving between me and Tyler, searching his face for some sign of what I might mean. Tyler's expression had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that told me, more than any words could have, that he already knew exactly what I was about to say. I told Claire as gently and as plainly as I could manage that 6 weeks earlier I had found a marriage certificate belonging to Tyler, dated 6 years prior, to a woman named Hannah Reyes, and that in all the research I had done since, I had found no record anywhere of that marriage ever being legally dissolved. I told her I had spent weeks hoping there was an innocent explanation, hoping Tyler would tell her himself before this moment ever had to happen, and that when he didn't, I could no longer stay silent and let her walk into a marriage that might not even be legal, built on a truth she had never been given the chance to know. The silence that followed those words was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life, heavy and complete, broken only by the sound of Claire's mother rising halfway out of her chair. Tyler stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward, his voice cracking as he told the room I was lying, that I had misunderstood something, that I was ruining his wedding over nothing. But when Claire turned to look at him directly and asked him, in a voice far steadier than I expected, whether any part of what I had said was true, Tyler did not answer her right away. That pause, that few seconds of silence where he could have denied it immediately and didn't, told everyone in that tent everything they needed to know, more clearly than any document folded in my pocket ever could have. What happened over the following 20 minutes is something I still think about often, the way an entire wedding reception can unravel in real time once one true sentence gets said out loud. Claire did not scream or cry in front of everyone, which somehow made it harder to watch than if she had. She simply stood up, removed the ring from her finger, and walked out of the tent alone, refusing help from her mother, her sister, or anyone else who tried to follow her. Tyler stayed frozen at the table for what felt like a full minute before he finally went after her, and I stood alone at that microphone, 200 faces turned toward me, some of them furious, some of them stunned. A few of them, I noticed later, quietly relieved that someone had finally said something. I left the reception that night without speaking to almost anyone, driving home in a wedding tuxedo I would never wear again, replaying the whole evening in my head over and over. I did not hear from Tyler for 11 days after that, which was the longest stretch of silence between us in over 2 decades of friendship. When he finally called, his voice was flat and exhausted, and he did not ask why I had done it, because by then he already understood the answer better than either of us wanted to say out loud. He told me Claire had confirmed everything herself, that she had tracked down Hannah's number through the records I had found, and that Hannah had confirmed, in a short and painful phone call, that she and Tyler had never legally divorced, that Tyler had simply stopped speaking to her 6 years earlier and disappeared from her life without ever finishing the paperwork. In the weeks that followed, the fallout moved through Tyler's life the way fallout always does, slower and more thoroughly than anyone expects at first. Because the marriage license had never actually been filed with the county, the ceremony itself carried no legal weight, which meant Claire was never truly Tyler's wife in the eyes of the law, only in front of the 200 people watching. That detail mattered more than I expected it to in the weeks that followed, because it meant Claire never had to go through the added humiliation of a formal annulment or divorce, only the quieter, harder work of walking away from a relationship she now understood had never fully been what she believed it was. Within a month, she had moved out of the apartment they shared, staying with her sister while she sorted through what she later called the strangest kind of grief, grieving something that had legally never existed at all. There was a darker layer underneath all of this that I didn't fully let myself think about until much later, which was the fact that Tyler had come within minutes of committing bigamy, a crime in the state we lived in, by attempting to marry Claire while still legally bound to Hannah. I later learned from Tyler's own lawyer that because the license was never filed and the ceremony was interrupted before the marriage was legally recorded, no prosecutor ever pursued charges, and the district attorney's office treated it as a private civil matter rather than a criminal one. I have thought about how differently this story might have ended if I had said nothing at all, if that unfiled license had gone through the mail a week later the way it was supposed to, and Tyler had found himself legally married to 2 women at once without either of them knowing about the other. Tyler's parents, who had spent months planning and paying for half of that wedding, learned the truth the same night everyone else did, standing in that tent in their own formal wear, watching their son's marriage collapse before it had even legally begun, in front of relatives who would talk about it for years. Tyler lost more than a bride in those weeks. He lost the version of himself that everyone, including me, had believed him to be for over 20 years. In the weeks after the wedding, I found myself replaying that toast constantly, not because I doubted the decision, but because I kept noticing how differently people in our shared circle of friends reacted to it. Some of them called me within days, telling me quietly that they had always sensed something guarded about the way Tyler talked about his past, and that they respected what I had done, even if they never would have found the courage to do it themselves. Others stopped returning my calls entirely, siding with Tyler out of a loyalty that had nothing to do with the facts, and everything to do with comfort, the simple human instinct to prefer a familiar story over an uncomfortable truth. I lost more friendships in those weeks than I expected to, and I learned something uncomfortable about myself in the process. That I had spent years measuring my own worth by how well liked I was in a room, and that standing firmly on the side of honesty meant accepting that not everyone was going to like me for it. Claire's family, understandably, wanted almost nothing to do with anyone connected to Tyler in the months that followed, myself included, even though I had been the one to bring the truth forward. I understood that reaction completely. I represented the worst night of their daughter's life, even if I had also been the reason she avoided walking further into a marriage that was never legally valid to begin with. I never reached out to Claire directly after that evening, out of respect for the fact that she needed space from every single person who had been standing in that tent, myself very much included, and I have always believed that was the right choice, even on the days it felt like the harder one. Our friendship did not survive that fall either. Not right away. Tyler called me twice more after that first conversation, and both times the calls ended with him asking how I could have chosen a woman I barely knew over the friendship we had built our entire lives on. I told him, as honestly as I could, that I hadn't chosen Claire over him. I had chosen the truth over a lie I could no longer help him carry. He didn't want to hear that answer, and eventually the calls stopped coming altogether. For months afterward, I lived with a strange, uncomfortable kind of quiet, missing the friend I had known since childhood, while still believing completely that I had done the only thing I could live with myself for doing. Almost 6 months passed before I heard from Tyler again. It was a Thursday evening in early spring, and I almost didn't recognize the number on my phone until I heard his voice, quieter and less certain than I had ever heard it in 25 years of friendship. He told me he was living in a small apartment across town, that the legal situation with Hannah had turned into something far more complicated than either of them expected. Because their marriage had never been formally dissolved, a house Hannah had purchased 3 years into their separation was technically still considered joint marital property under state law, something neither of them had ever properly closed out on paper. Hannah's attorney had filed to have the matter settled once and for all, and the hearing would determine both when the marriage should legally be considered over for property purposes, and whether Tyler's attempted marriage to Claire carried any legal consequences worth pursuing further. He told me he had a hearing coming up in 3 weeks, and that his lawyer had suggested he needed a witness who could speak honestly about the exact timeline of what he knew, and when he knew it, someone the court might actually believe. Then he asked me, his oldest friend, the man he hadn't spoken to in half a year, if I would be willing to help him. I sat with that phone call for a long time after we hung up, turning it over in my mind, the way I had turned over that marriage certificate on the floor of a storage unit 6 months earlier. Part of me wanted to tell him no immediately, to remind him that the last time I tried to help him toward honesty, he had called me a liar in front of 200 people and then disappeared from my life for half a year. But another part of me, the part that had known him since we were 7 years old riding bikes down the same street, understood that helping Tyler tell the truth in a courtroom was not the same as helping him hide from one, and that the version of loyalty I had always believed in was never about protecting someone from consequences. It was about standing beside them while they finally faced what they had done. Those 2 days between his call and mine were some of the strangest of my life, filled with a kind of quiet arithmetic I hadn't done since I was a kid, watching my brother get treated differently than me, except this time the scales were reversed, and I was the one holding something Tyler needed. I thought about every version of the friendship we had built since we were 7 years old. The summers spent at the lake. The year he drove 3 hours in the middle of the night when my father was in the hospital. The countless small kindnesses that don't make it into a story like this one, but that build a friendship brick by brick over 25 years. None of that history erased what he had done, but it also didn't disappear simply because he had lied to Claire and to me. I realized somewhere in those 2 days that forgiveness and accountability were not opposites, that I could hold both at once, helping him tell the truth in a courtroom, while still grieving the version of our friendship that had existed before that storage unit. I called Tyler back 2 days later and told him I would help him, but only under one condition, that whatever I said in that courtroom would be the same complete truth I had told Claire at that reception. Nothing softened, nothing left out to protect him. There was a long pause on the line before he answered, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded steadier than it had in the first call, almost relieved, as though some part of him had been waiting months for someone to hold him to exactly that standard. He told me that was all he was asking for, and for the first time since that night under the string lights, I felt like I was talking to a version of my friend who finally understood the difference between being protected and being enabled. In the 3 weeks leading up to that hearing, Tyler and I spoke more honestly than we had in years, even during the stretch when we were still speaking to each other regularly before any of this happened. He told me things about his first marriage to Hannah that I had never known, that they had married young and impulsively after dating only a few months, that the marriage had fallen apart almost immediately, and that instead of doing the difficult work of legally ending it, he had simply moved away, changed phone numbers, and let years pass, telling himself the problem would somehow resolve on its own if he ignored it long enough. Hearing him describe it that plainly, without excuses dressed up as explanations, was the first time since the wedding that I recognized something of my old friend again. Someone capable of looking directly at his own mistakes, instead of managing how other people perceived them. The hearing itself, 3 weeks later, was quieter and less dramatic than the wedding reception had been, just a small courtroom, a handful of lawyers, and the specific, careful language people use when they are trying to resolve something honestly instead of hiding from it. I told the truth, exactly as I had promised I would, about the envelope in that storage unit, about the weeks I spent researching public records, about the conversation on Tyler's back porch, and about the toast I gave that ended his marriage to Claire before it had even legally begun, in front of everyone he loved. Watching Tyler sit there and listen to all of it laid out plainly, without flinching or interrupting, told me something had genuinely shifted in him over those 6 months, something that had nothing to do with the outcome of the case, and everything to do with finally letting the truth exist in the open instead of hidden in a manila envelope. I never spoke to Claire again after that night at the reception, though I heard, through mutual friends, that she was doing well, that she had moved to a new city about a year later and was building a life entirely her own, unburdened by a marriage that had never legally existed to begin with. I did eventually speak to Hannah, and that conversation taught me things about the years before I ever knew her name. She told me she and Tyler had married impulsively in Nevada after only 4 months of dating, both of them barely 24, and that within a year the marriage had become something neither of them recognized, filled with arguments about money and a future they wanted different versions of. She told me Tyler simply stopped coming home one week, stopped answering calls, and eventually stopped existing in her life altogether, leaving her to assume for years that he had either died or simply vanished, since she had no way of knowing he had quietly resurfaced 3 states away under the same name, building an entirely new life, as though that chapter had never happened. Hannah never filed for divorce herself, she told me, partly out of anger, and partly because some part of her kept expecting him to eventually resurface, and finish what he started. When he finally did resurface, it was not with an apology, but with a lawyer, fighting her over a house she had bought and paid for entirely on her own during the years he was gone. I think about her sometimes, about the specific moment her expression changed when she asked Tyler if any part of what I said was true, and I have never once doubted that she deserved to know the answer before she said her vows, not after. Some people who heard this story afterward told me I destroyed a wedding that day. I have always believed, and I still believe now, that I simply refused to let a lie get married in front of 200 witnesses who thought they were watching something honest. Tyler and I are not exactly what we used to be, and I don't think we ever will be again, not fully. But we talk now, carefully, honestly, in a way we never quite did before all of this happened. He thanked me once, months after the hearing, not for the toast itself, which he told me he still wished had happened privately instead of in front of everyone he loved, but for refusing to let him keep hiding from something he now understood he could not have outrun forever. I told him the truth always finds its way into the room eventually, one way or another, and that the only real choice any of us ever have is whether we're the one who finally says it out loud, or the one who spends years hoping nobody else does first. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up, whether I would do it again exactly the same way if I had the chance. I have thought about that question more than almost any other question anyone has ever asked me, and my honest answer is that I would change very little about what I actually did, though I have wished many times that I had found the courage to speak to Tyler alone, privately, in the days before the wedding, rather than in front of 200 people holding champagne glasses. I did not do that because I was afraid that a private conversation would simply be denied, buried, and forgotten the way so many uncomfortable conversations are, and I made the decision that Claire deserved certainty over my own comfort. I still believe that was the right call, even if I understand now how much collateral damage came with it, damage that touched people who had done absolutely nothing wrong themselves. What stays with me most, even now, over a year removed from that evening, is not the silence in that tent, or the sound of Claire's chair scraping back as she stood up, or even the 11 days of silence that followed before Tyler finally called. What stays with me is a single sentence Hannah Reyes said to me months later when I finally worked up the nerve to call her myself and apologize for the role I had unknowingly played in her own long, complicated chapter with Tyler. She told me that for 6 years she had wondered if anyone in Tyler's life would ever care enough about the truth to go looking for it, and that as strange as the circumstances were, she was grateful someone finally had. That single sentence is the reason I have never once regretted standing up at that microphone, no matter how many friendships it cost me, and no matter how many people in that tent still remember me as the man who ruined a wedding instead of the man who refused to let one begin on a lie. So I want to ask you something before you go. If you had been standing in Ryan's position, holding that folded piece of paper, knowing what it would cost you the moment you opened your mouth, do you think what he did was the right thing? Was speaking up at that microphone an act of loyalty to the truth, or was it a betrayal of the one friendship that had carried him his whole life? There's no easy answer here, and I'm genuinely curious where you land. Tell me in the comments below, would you have said something, or would you have stayed silent and let the two of them figure it out on their own? If this story stayed with you, make sure you're subscribed to Unfinished Tales, because we bring you real, gripping stories like this one every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Go check out more of our videos right now, and we'll see you in the next one.